and will be posted and shared. And there it is. All right. So yeah, we can start whenever you're ready, Ron.
All right. So once again, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And this is a really sort of interesting and powerful discussion that we hopefully can have tonight. I know Kamran's put a great deal of research into this. So I'm very happy to be our moderator for this event. For those who don't know me, my name is Ron Watson, and I'm an associate professor in political science, but also in the health and society program, which is Beloit's version of public health over at Beloit College. As you all certainly know, tonight we're talking about these organizations that arose in the light of racialized violence in the United States for the purposes of self-defense. And so maybe I'd like to just get things started off tonight by asking you, Kamran, because you're sort of our main contact point for understanding this issue. I mean, I assume one of the organizations you're going to talk about is the Black Panthers, but start off telling us a little bit, what does minority self-defense mean in this context?
So when looking at minority self-defense, specifically within the conditions of the United States, we can really see it be split into three different sort of means, I guess. The first one is health. So we can see that during the periods that these organizations were operating, and a lot of it being similar today, there was massive disparity in medical treatment between majority communities and minority communities, and that would lead to then disproportionate death rates, disproportionate miscarriage rates, overall just minority communities being hit a lot harder by medical issues seen throughout the rest of the nation. So one thing that we can see is the Black Panther Party's free health clinics, the free breakfast for children program, and free ambulance services to make sure that people were taken care of in a way that they can live a healthy life without much interference from health scares. And so that people would be able to, in the case that they're not able to get to necessarily a free clinic or they can't take care of it themselves, they can be taken to a medical center without fear of being hit with extremely high ambulance ride bills or medical bills. Along with this, we can see the Young Lords taking, in one instance, a similar approach with their disease testing programs, where they would essentially just screen you for any concern that you have. And then in order to keep up sort of a more public health and public well-being, they also initiated what was called a trash offensive. So they would be bagging trash, and then they were hoping that the city would take it. But then when the city failed to do so, they decided to dispose of it themselves in a way that would best serve their needs and best serve the needs of the community. Along with this, they did clothes donations so that they could keep kids, again, healthy throughout the winter, healthy throughout times when they may not have the ability to get these things on their own. And then the American Indian movement, while not really having specific programs that addressed health concerns in the community, they spent a lot of their time fighting their hardest to close medical gaps and medical disparities between the settler population and the indigenous population within the United States. It also gets into political self-defense, which one of the main things that they were fighting for at the time, all three of them, was that indigenous Americans, the Black population, and the Puerto Rican population, along with the rest of the Hispanic population, should be exempt from fighting in the Vietnam War. This was seen as an infringement on their sovereignty as peoples colonized within the United States, and they thought that part of defending their community was making sure that they didn't have to go fight in a war that they may not have any interest in fighting. Along with this, they were fighting for, and I mentioned a little bit in the Vietnam section, self-determination for all peoples within the United States. Each one of these was a movement that recognized the intersectionality of their struggles and wished to fight for the freedom of all peoples. So what that means is they were trying to get, for example, the American Indian movement was trying to make sure that um, existing indigenous nations within the United States that don't necessarily have the full rights that they should be given as sovereign nations, they were hoping to get those nations that right. They were hoping to fight for full sovereignty from the United States and make sure that they actually have the ability to choose their own destiny. Along with that, another form of political defense that they fought for was attempting to get a fair trial for all people. At this time, and even today, getting a trial where, as a minority, you're tried by a jury of your peers, or you're tried in a way that isn't just in the service of the criminal justice system, it's nearly impossible and it most likely won't happen. So what they were attempting to do is making sure that, for example, if somebody were to commit a crime and they were a member of the Black population, rather than being tried by an all-white jury in a white city in a white jurisdiction, that they would be tried by their peers. Same with Puerto Rico and the Young Lords, and same with the American Indian movement. And then lastly, the thing that all three of these groups are most known for, which really kind of overshadows the rest, is the physical self-defense. Minority defense in the physical sense really was focused on police brutality at the time. This went for the Young Lords, this went for the Black Panthers, and this went for the American Indian movement. All three of them were having to deal with immense racial profiling and immense police brutality at this time, and a lot of them are still having to deal with that today. With that, the groups like the Black Panther Party would do things like just promoting defense against police brutality, telling people that, you don't have to take it. You don't have to just accept being beat on, and doing police patrols where they would make sure that people aren't just being beat on by the police. So, the Young Lords would mostly keep their self-defense to words and would mostly encourage people to be able to take that extra step to defend themselves. And the American Indian movement was never that often in a position where they would have to defend themselves in like an immediate sense. So we don't see too much of that occurring with them, but there still was the very clear point made that if necessary, they would defend themselves from external forces.
So I think this is interesting, and thank you for sort of laying out those three different areas. This is interesting for a variety of different reasons, because I think probably many of our members of our audience probably have seen those iconic photos of members of the Black Panther Party, for example, walking around armed, right? And probably have a sense of the stir that this caused at the time. But as you've pointed out, a good deal of this has to do with actual physical self-defense, right? Police brutality, and is especially sort of everywhere, but especially in some of the cities where the Black Panther Party was most active. I think especially around Oakland. It was really seen as something that was out of control. The police brutality was at that point in time, and that there was really no recourse. I think probably most people are familiar with what ended up happening to Fred Hampton, right? Shot to death in his bed by Chicago police, right? So there was clearly some precipitating issues here. But in your research, did you find any specific events that maybe triggered the formation of these groups? You can, so if you know of anything, just sort of specific events that may have triggered each one of those groups.
So with each of these groups, it's kind of interesting because there are definitely events that could potentially be pointed to as like a start, as a beginning, as a hard, uh, just like the gun firing at the beginning of a race. But when looking at it, it's a lot of buildup. It's a lot of tension that continuously gets put behind a door, and eventually, when you put enough force behind something, it's gonna break. And that's really what started the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and the American Indian Movement. The Black Panther Party um, is a little bit more into the vein of single issue beginnings, but I mean, really, all three of them were the. So the Black Panther Party started off as really a response to police brutality and mistreatment, and a lot of its more iconic revolutionary sentiments don't come in for, at the very least, a couple months, at the most a year or two. For the longest time, it was mostly focused on promoting community self-defense and self-defense. But as time went on, they began to uh, develop their own ideology for their times in a progression of different political ideologies. When reading into the Black Panther Party, you can really see that while obviously being heavily inspired by the Black Power movement that emerged from the civil rights movement, and being inspired by the actions of Malcolm X, we can also really see that their inspiration didn't stop domestically. One of the people that is extremely noted as being extremely important to the Black Panther Party was the chairman of the party of China at that time, Mao Zedong. And likely, if it weren't for that formation occurring, we would never have seen the Black Panther Party occurred. And I mean, that gets into a whole can of worms that I really can't get into, because they had such a beautiful international connection with one another. It's really amazing. But then the Young Lords, they were really emerging from a lack of economic and social resources for, at first, the Puerto Rican diaspora. One thing that I had found out during my research that I actually hadn't known before is that a majority of the Puerto Rican population in the United States isn't on the island of Puerto Rico. A majority is actually in the diaspora on the mainland United States. So their formation was originally in response to that, dealing with the police brutality that would face Puerto Ricans, the lack of economic opportunity that was constantly present, and the overall lack of social mobility that was felt by Puerto Ricans at the time, and most Hispanics. Now, as time went on, they started to respond more in the context of colonization and asking for sovereignty and independence for the island of Puerto Rico and for freedom of the Puerto Rican people, along with ending the exploitative economic practices done by the US to Puerto Rico. One thing in particular that was cited by a few people who were interviewed, who were used to be part of the Young Lords, was Operation Bootstrap, where essentially, and I think you could probably tell by the name that it's not going anywhere good, but it was an attempt by somebody in government to bring business into Puerto Rico. But in reality, what happened was there was obviously industry was brought in. There was not nearly an equal input that there was to output. So all that was really happening was just mass extraction from the island of Puerto Rico, with nothing being gained in return. And then the American Indian movement was, again, forming in response to racial profiling and police brutality by the police of indigenous peoples. And then as their battle continued, they transformed into, just like the Young Lords, a group fighting colonialism and occupation of indigenous lands that realistically should have been sovereign from the get-go, but aren't, because that is the nature of colonization.
So, you've talked a bit about, and thank you for that. I mean, I definitely see a lot of, and hopefully others do as well, a lot of what may have naturally led any of us, if placed in those same circumstances, to either cleave to these parties or to even consider, or these organizations, or to make them on our own. So one of the other questions, and you said a little bit about this earlier, with respect to the Black Panthers, but it probably bears saying again. But these groups also brought about a variety of social innovations, some things that we sort of take for granted today. And I think, again, the Black Panther Party is probably the easiest one. So maybe we'll just start there. What sort of innovations that we in American society take for granted today do you, or in your research, do you think are attributable to the Panthers and then these other organizations?
Yeah, I think one of the most impressive ones is, so during obviously there's still the New African Black Panther Party and other offshoots that exist today, but during the main period of strength for the Black Panther Party, we see a program coming into place called the Free Breakfast for Children program. And if you were to look it up, you can actually find some really just heartwarming pictures of Bobby Seale putting some food onto the plates of the children who are there. And it's shown in other media attempting to portray what the Black Panther Party was. But that would actually go on to inspire the creation of national food programs within the United States that the federal government would implement. And while I use the word inspire, it's very similar to why the New Deal happened, in that it was out of fear for the groups becoming larger and larger and creating a larger impact than was wished for. And that we'll get into later when talking about the downfall. The Young Lords, at one point, they occupied a hospital in the Bronx and actually wound up making them expand the medical coverage of their patients. They realized that there was mistreatment occurring. They realized that there was not a genuine good coverage of the people who were going to this hospital. So they took initiative, and at least at that point, forced Lincoln Hospital to take better care of its patients and actually do so for a reasonable amount, if any, in return. And then along with this, we can see the American Indian movement, which didn't produce as much in the program sense, but more so in the ideological sense, in the theoretical and organizational sense. And that really goes with all three of them, the amount that they added. If you were to look into the platforms of each of these groups, the Black Panther parties had their 10-point program, the Young Lords had a 13-point program, and then the American Indian movement, I believe, had a 20-point program, all of which had some differences for each of their conditions, as we know that the Black population in the United States, the Puerto Rican population within the United States, and the indigenous population within the United States do not have the exact same conditions. So there were differences, obviously, but really in each of these programs, we can see the beginning of what would form minority nationalist movements and minority progressive movements throughout the US that we can see even up until today, with many groups still building off of these platforms, building off of the programs that were introduced. And there's even some interesting theoretical developments that were added by Fred Hampton and Huey P. Newton.
Right on. And I'm always struck by, as some folks often talk about how even 4K and those sorts of programs that we know of, that they really can be sort of traced back to the Black Panther Party. Yeah, we have a comment here from Katie. It says a great youth novel covering a bit about the Black Panthers and the breakfast program, and there's a link there. So for those of you who are interested in learning further about that, please do check that out. And thank you for posting that, Katie. So, you know, this is one of the pieces that I've found interesting about this, right, is that these organizations have contributed to society in ways that often, when we think about political parties, right, like actual sort of declared political parties, especially minor parties, we often see minor parties bringing issues to the fore that the major parties have either ignored or have found to be sort of politically problematic or political hot potatoes. But those minor parties emerge, people then sort of gravitate to those ideas. And in a way, the minor parties, and in this case, these minority parties, like literal sort of racial and ethnic minority parties and movements, they, in a certain way, permit the larger group, right, the larger society or larger parties to adopt those ideas. Some would say co-opt those ideas. And I think that there's definitely some truth to that as well. So that's, you know, I think one of the exciting pieces of what these organizations can and have done. So let's talk for a little bit about what happened to them. I think that there are any number of directions we can go here, but, you know, we can be as direct as possible. I mean, today, these organizations, whether it's you know, of course, there are these, in some respects, at least ideological successor organizations exist, but each of these organizations have faced some issues that ultimately led to their demise, at least in the present form they were in at the time. So can you say a little bit about what sort of struck the fatal blows to these groups? And you can, you know, start with one, whichever you like, and then go to the others.
Yeah, so this is where the event gets pretty heavy. But so while there are successor groups, there are also none of them that, at least for these specific groups, have actually reached the scale that the original Black Panther Party did, that the original Young Lords did, or that the original American Indian movement did. However, there are definitely groups in the same vein that have started and have been building it, and the Black Lives Matter protests of last year actually wound up pushing a lot more people into membership of those groups. But really what we can see breaking down the power that these groups have is it's three things really. It's prison, it's assassination, and it's a little thing called Cointelpro. So prison is, I mean, as you can imagine, unlike what we hear in like elementary school history classes, the United States, just like all nations, does have political prisoners. And with that, we can see that there were many members of the Black Panther Party, the American Indian movement, and the Young Lords who were imprisoned at the height of the movement, were imprisoned at the formation of the movement, and were imprisoned at the very end of the movement, with many actually still being in prison today. I actually wrote down a list of the people who, some of the people who are still in prison to this day. We have Leonard Peltier of the American Indian movement, Sundiata Acoli of the Black Panther Party. Asada Shakur is not in prison. She is actually currently in Cuba, where she has been safe from prison because the United States still actually has a bounty on her head to put her in prison. Oscar Rivera, who was released only in 2017, so that was 4 years ago. And then Kojo Bomani Sababu, who was also has been in prison for decades at this point. All of these people have either had to leave or have been in prison for decades, with some of them being in prison as much as 40, 50 years. It's, I don't know. I mean, they've got, I can't think of anything that's as empowering as knowing that a lot of these people have been going through that and still are staying ideologically disciplined and keeping their actions forward. Along with this, we have assassination. We have obviously Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, two people who were murdered in a police raid that was, it was a raid, but it was meant as a deliberate assassination of Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party at the time. And that's why we chose to have this event in December. This is the month that he was murdered in. And even today, there are still times where they will have to actually replace the headstone because it gets shot at by the current police department. Same thing with, we also have Anna Mae Aquash, who was, I mean, I have to say, allegedly murdered by the police. It was originally deemed a death by exposure, but then they realized she was murdered execution style, and the FBI attempted to cover up her murder. And then from there, we have Manuel Ramos, who was a leading figure in the Young Lords movement and was actually, again, murdered by the police. And one of the attorneys of the Black Panther Party estimated there were roughly at least 28 others who were murdered by the police during the years of operation of the original Black Panther Party. And then along with this, we get into Cointelpro. Cointelpro is a counterintelligence project put forth by the Federal Bureau of Investigation with help from other departments of the federal government that was essentially attempting to use counterintelligence to discredit these various groups, to sow mistrust in these various groups, and to bring as much turmoil as they could. There are a couple really big things that were done. One is the FBI infiltration of the Black Panther Party, and that actually led to one of the big splits between in the Black Panther Party, with for a long time people thinking of Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, as I believe at one point Fred Hampton called him a black fascist, but in reality he was a national liberationist, just like the rest of them were. But this is the power of counterintelligence, where it was able to make this big of a split between two giant figures in Black nationalism. Another thing that was done was a fake coloring book made by the FBI, which really just goes to show the insidiousness of this program, trying to make it seem as though the Black Panther Party is promoting to kids to commit violence, when in reality, that was never something done by the Black Panther Party. Coloring book was proven to be made by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and is nothing more than a fabrication by them to try to make people view the Black Panther Party as violent. They were trying to make people view the Black youth as violent. They were trying to make people view minorities as a threat to white life in America.
So, I mean, this is, I think maybe most people have heard of Cointelpro, and for those who haven't, I urge you to do more research on this. This is, in an age where conspiracy theories are everywhere and everyone seems to have their pet theories around everything. There are actual conspiracies within the U.S. government that simply have never really gotten the attention that they should have, and this is without question certainly one of them. Put in place by Hoover, who was not only the longest serving person in American government that we think at least the head of a bureau, and clearly had some real issues in a variety of different senses, right? And again, lots has been written about the man personally as well. At any rate, so I guess now, as it's about 6:40, so we're sort of getting to what I'm going to say is probably our last substantive question here, and then we can maybe get into some audience questions. And feel free, you all, to drop questions if you have them in the chat, and we'll see if we can go ahead and get to those. But you mentioned a little bit as you've been talking about each of these points we've discussed. You've said things like, well, this is still happening with respect to the courts, and this is still happening with respect to police brutality. So I guess here's my question. Is there a need for those organizations today? And if so, why? And do you see organizations out there that are meeting, sort of meeting that need? I mean, I think, selfishly, I'll say I think the Black Lives Matter movement is certainly one of them. But I guess the basic question is, do you see a need for the existence of these kinds of organizations today, and why?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Especially with some of the things that were very clearly made evident in 2020, 2021, as much as those things have constantly been going on, I feel like there's actually been the mass support of it, that a vanguard party like the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, or the American Indian movement can do some real good and importance in pushing the struggle forward and pushing the struggle to a new level. And I think that in answering this question, it's important to reiterate the three areas of self-defense: health, politics, and physical. We can see that even today, there is still dangers of health faced by minority communities at a disproportionate level to white communities. With, for example, in one class I took a white collar crime class. And one of the principles that we learned about was that corporations will actually choose to break more regulations and rules in areas where they know that there's a larger minority population, specifically a larger Black population, because they know that that's a way that they can get away with it. So when we know that something like that's going on, and we see things like the water being as absolutely destroyed as it is in states like Michigan, in other states throughout the United States, it's really hard to say that we don't need the health perspective being taken care of, especially when we see, for example, Black mothers specifically dying of childbirth at a disproportionate rate because we're still operating under phony race science that says that Black women can handle more pain than white women. So then it's assumed that they don't have to give the same amount of care to those Black women. And then we have disproportionate deaths of Black women while giving birth. Same thing in the political side of things. If a person of color were to commit the same crime as a white person, we know very well that they will not get a fair trial. We saw that just not that long ago in one case decision, because there was a white boy who killed 2 people and injured a third, and then there were multiple Black men, Black teens, Black women who have just genuinely defended themselves, not serving reaction, not serving fascist sympathies, not serving the interests of white supremacy, who have gotten jail time. Meanwhile, this person will most likely be able to use this on whatever application they like, and they'll be fine. Same with physical defense, where we can see that there genuinely is a physical threat to people. I mean, we know that hate crime has been on the rise. We know that violence from white supremacists has been on the rise. We know that violence by the police has never stopped. And then on top of that, violence by border patrols has never stopped, and it's only gotten worse. Violence by the federal government has only gotten worse. We know what's happening. Of course it's necessary. It's always going to be necessary.
Well, I mean, I think that you raised some compelling points here. I mean, especially the issues around health are very near and dear to me, because this is the area that I study, particularly maternal and child health, and more specifically infant mortality and maternal mortality. Um, so we do have a few questions. And we've got one in the chat, and then we'll come over to Richard Johnson, who has a hand up. Lonnie Brigham is asking, so what is your take or understanding of the original Black Panthers of Milwaukee?
Ron, I'll leave that to you. I actually don't know a whole lot about the Milwaukee branch of the Black Panther Party. I would like to learn more, though.
Well, you know what I'm going to do. I mean, I think Lonnie, do you want to speak on this a little bit? Okay. Yeah. I mean,
let me say this. I'm still doing my research on them myself personally. I know my introduction to them was about maybe a couple of years back, but I have a very vested interest in the Black Panther movement in general. Both my fathers, my natural father and my uncle who raised me, were members of the original Black Panther Party with Fred Hampton in Chicago. I myself didn't know that growing up, but then when when I had to be on my own at a very early age, the Black Peace Stones were the organizations that came into my neighborhood and gave us a choice back in the day to live or die, so to speak. You know, a little rougher back then, but their main mission was similar to what Hampton was doing and what was going on in Oakland back in the past of community pride. You know, in my time, we had we respected our neighborhood. We were the police. We were the checks and balances in our neighborhood of keeping everybody safe. You know, we had a mission of pride, first of all. There was no disrespecting of women. There was no disrespecting of each other, despite some of the stuff that you heard back in the past. And I'm an old cat. I'm 57, and when I was involved personally, this was 78 to 83, and you know, I saw the change from the movement from going peaceful to extreme when it came to street violence and more gang activity. But back to the Milwaukee Black Panthers, I saw them more so in during the Black Matters movement of the issues of the deaths of Black men, and it was just something that I really wanted to learn more about. So I thought you may have more insight on them. My understanding to them is still infancy, you know, in the infancy stage. But I just wanted to see if anybody else had any take on their mission and their understanding. How is it still connected to similar to what was done in the past, or are they looking at it? Are they a different vanguard for the future? So that's just my 2 cents. So.
Right on. No, thank you. And thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think, you know, for myself as well, I have a sort of more general knowledge of particularly the Black Panther Party, but, you know, most of it is around what was happening in California, and then, and to a lesser extent, what happened in Chicago. But thank you for sharing that. And let's come over to Richard Johnson. Go ahead.
Okay. The perception of the Black Panther movement among the public is that they're extremely violent organization. How did they, what was the genesis of that? How did they evolve from an organization which was nonviolent into a violent organization? And was the FBI involved, and who was the president when the FBI became involved?
Okay. I mean, I think I can probably jump in there, Kamran, and feel free to add anything additionally. Yeah, I mean, part of understanding how that evolution occurred is understanding the sort of threat that the Black Panthers represented. One of the best examples of this is what happened in California. So As most of you probably know, Ronald Reagan, who eventually became US president, was at one point the governor of California. And happened to be governor of California during the time of the emergence in Oakland of the Black Panthers. And during that time, one of the things that was so interesting is you had Reagan, like many conservatives then and now, was a strong proponent of course, the Second Amendment, right? And this was exactly the sort of rhetoric that would eventually get him in trouble. And what I will say that is that the Black Panther movement was like, yeah, absolutely, right on. And this is why we, as you know, we have a Second Amendment right to be armed, and indeed they do, and they did. And there's a sort of iconic event when they show up to the Capitol armed, and wouldn't you know it, Reagan very soon thereafter became a proponent of gun control in the state of California. And when I say, soon thereafter, I mean almost immediately thereafter, right? Moved to restrict where guns could be carried, and the restrictions on buying them and who could buy them and those sorts of things. The sorts of restrictions that one can sort of scarcely imagine, but imagine coming from a conservative voice today. And of course, that was just situational for Reagan. But more importantly, I think we cannot underestimate, Richard, the work of Cointelpro. J. Edgar Hoover was heading the FBI at the time. He was the director, and is, like I said, is known to be, I think, the longest serving head of a bureaucracy in U.S. government, right? And so, at the end of the day, he had a very, very, what we would now, I think, pretty openly call a very pernicious and nefarious agenda for anyone he deemed to be a threat to U.S. national security. And he had a very strong bent against any of the minority organizations that were sort of moving into what he again saw as sort of riling up the minority populations, getting them excited, and what he would term as sort of militarism, right? And again, there's a very specific use of this language of sort of militarism and militaristic, because again, it allows those groups to be painted as threats and allows their what they're calling for, right? Their demands to be ignored, or to be warped and construed as something else. And Cointelpro was, it was no joke, right? I mean, it's the force of the American government, right? Of the federal government, especially its clandestine work, to literally undermine people who were trying to work for social change. So it's really extraordinary, and it was treated as a conspiracy, as a baseless conspiracy until the late 1980s. When we start to see scholars who dipped into this start to emerge, and they say, wait, what is this thing Cointelpro? And we finally start to get the Freedom of Information documents that really show that this was an active program. And it really wasn't until the late 1990s when it was clear that this had happened. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but this was a deliberate act of demonization of these groups. No group is perfect, but they certainly were not any of them violent in the ways that we have seen other groups, and particularly any number of largely white groups sort of treated with this sort of kid gloves, as we would say. I still remember what happened at the Mirza building in Oklahoma, right? And again, domestic terrorism has, and I should say largely white driven domestic terrorism has gone completely under the radar during that same time, right? So these are actual threats to national security that have been ignored in order to carry out this agenda against imagined threats. So that's my answer. I don't know if Kamran, if you have anything else to add, and then of course we want to dive into some more questions since we have time.
Yeah, I mean, really, the main thing that I would want to try, the main thing that comes to mind when talking about that and the violence perceived to the Black Panther Party, in a lot of situations like this, we can see that the United States pushes itself onto others. It's a deflection. So a lot of times whatever the US is doing is going to be painted onto another country, onto another group, onto another people. The same thing happened in this situation. The US was doing constant violence against minority communities. The US was there's one section of the Young Lords program that talks about how they are opposed to violence. They're opposed to the violence of hunger, the violence of lack of healthcare, the violence of homelessness. But then what's happened is then the giving of cooperative houses, the giving of healthcare, the providing of food is then painted as worse than having those things or than not having those things. It's interesting. It's a game of words to create a reality that doesn't exist.
Yeah, thank you, Kamran. And let me say also, yeah, thank you, Mark. You pointed out that, and again, I have not examined this, right? But I do hope, Mark was saying that he thinks that it may be Representative Bobby Rush may be trying to get more information released on Cointelpro. And I will, really say, I think this is extremely, extremely important to get those documents out there, because it will really continue to shed light on just how extensive this program of counterintelligence, the use of counterintelligence techniques against domestic groups really was in the United States. Branching to serve the Black aliens, right? Okay, so I see what you're saying there, Lonnie, as well, right?
Understanding the Black Panther Party and marginalized defense confirmation message HTML from Zoom, quiet Zoom, sub escape Zoom meeting.
Okay, I'm back on. Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So let's, are there any other questions? Any other thoughts that folks have here? Just sort of looking around and seeing if folks have anything else. If not, I have a question I'd like to ask everyone just in our sort of final minutes. Given what you've known about these groups or what you've heard about them, and now hearing tonight about why they formed, right? This idea of self-defense. How many of you think that you would have yourself matriculated into some organization that was similar, given the threat, given the level of threat? Could you see yourself? I see some people are putting, you can put in the chat, right? You don't necessarily have to sort of vocalize it. Because I'll tell you right now, there's no question that especially given the times, I would have without question been a part of one of these groups. It's one of those things, right? Where especially in the United States, where we have this ingrained sense that the Second Amendment is there. Of course, we know the Second Amendment has some other issues and why it emerged, and why it's been so strongly protected. But at least the superficial rhetoric is that this is here for self-defense, for protection against the tyranny of government, and then to a lesser extent the tyranny of those who would harm us. It seems to me like a sort of slam dunk, right? And I guess this is where Reagan ran into trouble, is that here was an actual group attempting to protect itself from the more tyrannical aspects of a state and state apparatus, and yet instead of supporting that, the idea is to flip that around. So and I'm looking in the chat. I see, yeah, Susan says absolutely. Christy says, I have so much history to learn. Was there ever an Asian American group that formed for similar reasons? I know that there was. And right, off the top of my head right now, I cannot remember, but I want to say it was largely based around San Francisco. I want to say that. But again, this is one of those places where, given the history of what has happened, especially to Japanese Americans, I think it's very likely that there was a group. And now whether I can assure you that it did not rise to the level of prominence that these other organizations did, because of their size and because of some of the more high profile events that occurred with those groups, including, of course, as Kamran has pointed out, assassinations and other sorts of direct action against them. And of course, no one can forget what happened with AIM at Wounded Knee. So I said, Nick, you say I have worked with some of the modern groups like these, although there are plenty of differences. Yes, indeed, right? And differences both in the successor groups, right? Some have taken a much more what we might consider to be intensely nationalist bent, right? Meaning separatist nationalist bent, but others certainly have continued to sort of push these struggles forward. We talk about Black Lives Matter, right? Again, not a successor per se to the Black Panther movement and the Black Panther Party, but certainly inspired ideologically by this need for social justice. So, Katie, you say here, what connections do you see in the Black Panther platform ideas and present day calls for police reforms? Kamran, do you want to jump on this, or do you want me to? I mean, I can say, go ahead, please. By all means.
So it's actually a really interesting question, and it gets into a lot of the more theoretical and ideological aspects of the Black Panther Party and groups like this, and that in a lot of ways they were opposed to electoralism, not in a dogmatic sense, but they were not believers that the ideas of reform, the ideas of slow change would get us to the point that we need to be at. They were members of revolutionary vanguard parties. Now, this doesn't mean that they abstained fully from electoral politics. This doesn't mean that they were like people's war or nothing, but they definitely took strong stances. And I would say that the closest political current that I see today is in more of the police abolition movement. In a lot of ways, since the get-go, the Black Panther Party and their and groups similar to it were calling for more community handling of the issues. And I mean, even when looking at their political stances, while still believing in the continuation of the state, things of that sort, they definitely wanted to have a prison system or a police system that is so different from the ones that we see today that we would essentially effectively have abolished the current prison system.
So, I mean, I think this is definitely a good point. If you look at the 10-point program that the Panther Party back in, I think, 1966 had, there are several points, 7, 8, and 9. If you take a look at those, you can look those up, that really tie directly to these issues of police reform. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'll go ahead and wrap up here quickly. But yes, in the past, they called for an immediate end to police brutality, which is, sort of a direct parallel to what we see today. They called for the release from jail and prisons of particularly Black males. And that's sort of paralleling in an interesting way the movement to avoid prison, and sort of not just the avoidance of prison, but the attempts to sort of address this school to prison and other sorts of pipelines, and this idea of, again, self-defense, right? That Black people, given the circumstances, should have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, and they should be able to bear arms. And that's, I think, a less of a direct, how can I say it? A sort of direct relationship to police reform. But it does still tie in the fact that if you are an armed Black individual, and at this point, any number of experiments have been done with this. One I watched not too long ago, a few weeks ago, that was very disturbing for me. You really cannot walk around with a gun, a visible gun, and I know a lot of people are like, well, this my friend Mike, yeah, he got lucky. Most of the experiments that we see, the reaction is pretty dramatic. When you can have a white individual, if Kamran is walking around with his rifle slung over his shoulder, he can sort of walk down the street and be addressed calmly, if molested at all by police. And if I walk down the street, it's going to be guns out immediately. There's no conversation, get on the ground, those sorts of things. And so in that sense too, it is tied to this idea that either we have Second Amendment rights and we have the right to bear arms, or we don't, right? And that then changes the ways in which police are then charged with engaging me as a member of the public who is, rightfully, or at least, sort of dutifully armed. So we're sort of, riffing at the moment because we're, our schedule, our schedule was originally from 6 to 7:30. And so we do have some time, but we also recognize that, the last bit of time we like to spend just either getting questions from people, and if folks want us to go ahead and end recording, we can do that if you're more comfortable having some conversations that way. We'll keep going if there are more questions, and if folks are okay with the recording, we'll just carry on this way. Okay, all right, and you can always just message me if you have anything else, or you have an issue with the recording. So, are there any other questions? I see we have something here, right? So creating the new state within the old seems like the only viable option in terms of police reform. Mark, can you say a little bit more about that? What do you, describe for us what you're talking about?
Well, it just seems like to address policing can't be a piecemeal thing, as Kamran was mentioning. It has to be a radical change. I don't know what else to say about that, except that those groups are actually creating their own communities within the old state.
So I see what I think I see what you mean. So you're really sort of pressing this idea that, maybe one of the only ways to do this is through a more sort of sovereign structure, right? That may be the sort of ideal of what should have happened with indigenous communities, American Indian communities, right? And that we see sometimes where reservations, for example, are adjudicated and otherwise controlled by tribal police and that sort of thing, right? Is that sort of, yeah, that's okay.
Well,
all right.
They get to choose how they want to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So a much stronger sense of self-determination. I mean,
Yes.
I think this is yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, I think this is a really interesting point, right? Because it's, my sense is that many people balk at the idea of, for example, Black people being able to, or being the ones who police Black people, right? Or, whether are Hispanics, Latino, Latinx individuals being the one who police them, and so on and so forth, in a similar way to what we see on tribal lands. I mean, I'm one who would argue that, probably this is something that should have been considered, given the depths of racial animosity and particularly anti-Black, but largely sort of anti-non-white racism and discrimination in the country. That maybe something along these lines is probably should not have been off the table. There's in political science, we don't hear about it very frequently, but there is this idea, at least in some countries and in the international, on the international level, of the idea of a consociation. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with that term, but a consociation is thought of as a sort of government configuration that you can have when you have very serious cleavages in your society. Today, I think the former Yugoslavia, some of the areas within that would be considered a consociation. Bosnia-Herzegovina, places where they have multiple presidents and multiple ethnic communities that have relatively clear lines drawn. One of the oldest examples of a consociation is the Netherlands, which no one thinks of as having had these major cleavages, right? But at one point, the cleavage between Catholic and Protestant was such that, rather than destroy the country, they said, well, look, we'll just split things 50-50 or however, right? And so there's a way in which that does make some sense if the country's populations were stuck in certain places, right? And of course, today that's a very, very difficult proposition. But it's, at some point it could have been possible, but obviously not now. So here's another question here. So if police aren't accountable to their community, they operate without the consent of the community. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? And so maybe one of the questions is how do we figure out ways to make police in particular more accountable to their communities? And if people have any ideas or thoughts about that, by all means chime in, and then we'll go to some of the other questions and points here.
So actually I had a couple things I wanted to jump in on. So and this kind of ties into Santo's question as well. So Santo asked, did the Panthers advocate separatism as the government put more pressure on them? And so with Mark's first question, it really gets into the ideological lens of the Black Panther Party. So in looking at how they formed, the tradition that they come from politically, and the just the revolutionary tradition that was occurring at the time as well, we can really see that the ideas of dual power were extremely important in revolutionary movements, where in order to have revolution, you first have to establish your own power structure. Otherwise, there's a couple good books on it. I can't remember the name of them right now, but it talks about how you have to have these structures built ahead of time, and you can't rely on spontaneity to get you to the end line. And that's sort of where the idea of constructing essentially your own state at the end of the day comes into play. And then that kind of gets into, did the Panthers advocate separatism? No. I feel like that's, some lines did. It gets confusing. There's a tradition among Marxist-Leninist organizations sometimes where it's like there's like different splits, because it's very open about criticism, about argument, things of that sort. So what we see is that there are lines that do advocate separatism, but that is a minority of the lines. We don't really see a large chunk that is actually advocating for separatism. So what we do see, though, is the advocation of minority revolutionary nationalism, which is not the same as standard nationalism. When a lot of times, I think, especially in the US, when we think of nationalism, we think of the kind of nationalism that people have for the US, the kind of patriotism that people have for the US, where it's very exclusionary. It's very much the US is the best, things of that sort. It's not exactly the same in what we see regarding minority nationalism. Nationalism of minority populations, specifically in colonized populations, is an extremely revolutionary and inclusive ideology that ties in with internationalism. So while the Black Panthers were advocating for Black nationalism, while the Young Lords were advocating for Puerto Rican nationalism, while the American Indian movement was advocating for indigenous nationalism, none of them was at the expense of the other. All of them were seeking to work together to decolonize their own populations. And we can see the same thing happens internationally. So that's sort of where that comes into play. It's kind of like, if you want to see an international example, look at the way that Ireland and Palestine deal with one another. It's really amazing. But that's an example of minority nationalism at some of its peak, honestly. Love it. But yeah, and then Mark, yes, were you referring to prefigurative politics? I'm not entirely sure what that is.
Mark, do you want to jump in and clarify on this?
No, it was just, I was asking Cameron, when you said we have to have some sort of structure initially and not just spontaneously go to the next stage, I think that's kind of prefigurative politics. And I didn't know if that was what you were referring to when you said you had a couple of references.
I mean, it seems to be very similar in ideas. It's really just a matter of like, so like, for example, we can see with I'm trying to think of an example that people will like. So let's just go with a Black Panther Party hypothetical. Let's say that the Black Panther Party was able to get to the point that they were able to move past the restrictions put on them by the federal government, and they were able to institute their own power. It becomes necessary to have those. I'm really trying to think of a good way to talk about this. Essentially, you can't have revolution spontaneously, so you need to have things like electoral processes, food distribution, medical care distribution, and policing figured out ahead of time, and then you can jump into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about, Cameron, is the beginning of sort of moving out of a revolutionary or vanguard phase, right? And then getting to the actual work of governance, right? Which typically does require some structure. Of course, there are any number at least ideologically, any number of groups that might argue differently, right? Libertarians might argue differently. Anarchists might argue differently, right? Or they might argue around what level of structure is needed. I don't think any would say that there's none, right? But what you're talking about is how you transform a revolutionary movement into into how life then is, right? And I haven't really seen an example, and I think this may be what you're talking about prefigurative politics, Mark, right? Is this idea of rather than pushing for sort of revolution all the time and constantly, that trying to figure out ways in which you can transform your systems and replace those systems that are problematic by way of doing what the revolutionary work wanted to do, right? And like how you actually get to the root of making it happen. We've got a couple of other points here. I was asked to talk a little bit about, and thank you, Cameron, for that. I was asked to talk a little bit about what we've seen happen with respect to police reforms. Yeah, I did. I spoke a little bit about this, I think maybe last year. Wow, time really flies, right? But there was a great deal of energy when the events around George Floyd's murder occurred, and everything that happened from that point. A great deal of energy around issues like sort of defunding or changing the funding schemes for policing. And I think there was a great deal of hope that there was going to be, okay, like this is it, right? This is the last of the egregious things, right? And so now we have to have, more sort of police training, more different approaches, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, one of the major legislative moves or attempts to make this into a sort of, this popular legislation that we saw in Minnesota, unfortunately did not pass. There was an attempt, some of you probably know, to really sort of change how the police department there would be shaped, not only funded, but what it would look like. And that didn't pass. That referendum didn't pass, despite the sort of high profile arguments that were being made, or I should say assertions that were being made by the city council there. So, and of course, these egregious actions have continued. There have been any number of folks who have lost their lives in incidents that should never have occurred, but did since then. So yeah, I mean, I wish that the news were somehow better. Some of our police reforms have really stalled, and this political moment has been part of what is making it difficult. The extreme polarization that we're seeing, the fact that people perceive that the murder rate in the United States, has gone up, quote unquote, dramatically, right? Of course, it did go up, but it's not dramatically. For those of us who lived through the 70s, in particular in the 80s, the U.S. murder rate is still nowhere near what it was then, right? Back in the quote unquote, past or good old days, right? So there is that. Of course, any increase in violent crime is worrying, but that also stalled, right? Immediately people said, oh, well, it's because of all of these, ban the, defund the police and all of this, and then the scrutiny that police face. So there was, a sort of built-in desire to let go of those changes, even though those clearly weren't the issue. As someone at the college, we and colleges nationwide are struggling with the impact and to deal with the impact that the pandemic has had on all of our students, for example, right? So clearly there's this externality of an unprecedented, literally unprecedented social event that is sort of driving a good deal of this behavior. And Lonnie, you mentioned here that there are some folks doing some police reform. Teresa Gazaway, first non-enforcement officer, you're saying, right?
Yeah, her background, she's a non. I don't know how to correctly say it, but she's never been a police officer. She was an administrator for several years in Jersey, in the city in Jersey. So she was a civilian administrator for about a decade or so. Then she was also on their civilian oversight board. And the mayor of Providence, New Providence, is a white mayor, young gun, and he appointed her chief of police. And she has been making some heavy moves. And the one move that really stuck out to me in her tenure so far is all police complaints come to her. All police complaints come to her. No administrator, nobody else come to her. She has also reinstituted, which I consider myself a historian of policing from the street level, from the ground level, from Chicago, where I saw them go from two parties in the car, to one party in the police squad, based on whatever reasons, political reasons, funding reasons, whatever. She has reinstituted that in her city, putting two officers in the squad car and putting them on point to watch each other. She is phenomenal. I don't know how long she's gonna live. I don't want to say that, but she is making some headway in Jersey. And this young gun as a mayor, I applaud him, because she may not be, she doesn't have the right to carry a gun. She doesn't enforce, she doesn't have the right to arrest, but she knows policing, and she knows it from the paper trails and been in oversight. And those two moves right there, to me, stood out greatly. And then also reform. Some people know that I used to be the chair of African American Liaison Advisory Committee here for Janesville Police Department. And one of the things that I'd like to stress, I thought I was stressing, was to go back to the old school, Sir Robert Peel. If you look at his 10 to 12 points, back then, those were some heady points. If we can go back to some of those points, I think we may have a good chance of reforming. I don't know what defunding is. Actually, I don't really understand it, but I do know that this sister is making some moves. And everybody, I think all eyes right now is on her, because she is doing some things out there that, of course, the union is fighting her, but she is making some solid moves. She's not just coming in there screaming and throwing things out. She is working within the system that has already been there, and she's improving upon it. And that complaint part of it is one of the things that is to me is key in reform, because you got to get some true eyes and ears looking and hearing what is going on out there to make some reforms. You know, and then also, I mean, and my last point is reform. Look at the people that you are harming. Look at the people that you are harming. I was taught that, you know, there was the alpha males, you know, that were becoming police officers, those who were cops, that was captains of teams and couldn't go to college or couldn't make it to the military. Then there was those who was bullies that, you know, now they got a badge and a gun so they can get back some of their power that they lost when they were being bullied. The third one was those who actually want to help, to serve and protect, which is no longer on squad cars anymore. That has been taken away. It's law enforcement, is preserve the law. And those guys get swallowed up. But the last interesting point that I was taught by my father, who was a 42-year cop in Chicago, this is what always strikes me. It takes a thief to catch a thief. Back then, when he was becoming a police officer, his psychological evaluations were given to the point where a cop and a criminal were scoring the same on the evaluations. Not the same number, but almost identically scored and checked the boxes. So there you go right there. So you takes a thief to catch a thief. I get it, it makes sense. I mean, who do you use to stop crime, but somebody who knows the crime? Who are we using now to help our drug addicts and our stop recidivism? People who've been in the system, people who are drug addicts. So that makes sense. We have to look at who we are harming. You know, we have to bring back psychological evaluation to the point where you have some idea of who you hire. I'm not saying lock it in, but at least give you an idea of what kind of individual you about to bring into this organization, you know, so. But we need to look at, I mean, if all of us really want some reform, I think we also take a look at and get on board with this young lady out in New Providence, New Jersey, I'm not sure how to say it, because she is doing some stuff out there that is phenomenal. And actually she's getting some buy-in from the rank and file. And that is key, the buy-in from the rank and file. So thank you.
Right on. Thank you so much, Lonnie. And Santo, I see you posted about most people don't know what defunding the police means. So I'll just mention it very briefly. That this sort of emerged as you know, one of the ways to sort of get at changing this outcome, right, of, you know, over policing of communities, particularly of communities of color, and particularly of poor communities of color and individuals. And this is tied to this military hardware that was being sort of largely passed down to police departments nationwide. And so the idea behind defunding the police is, okay, if you have a police department that is not performing well, meaning that it is causing a great deal of damage to the communities, to the community it serves, or is, you know, using its funds to buy a variety of different military hardware, then doesn't it make a lot of sense, a lot more sense, to send those funds to where they could actually prevent crimes and the issues that police are allegedly there to address from happening in the first place? And that's really what it was meant, what defunding police has been about, right? The idea that if you have a department that doesn't know how to, seemingly, goes, constantly has to harm individuals, and so on and so forth, then that's a department that needs to be rethought, right? That its funds need to be reallocated, because it's not doing, no one has hired police on to go out and willy-nilly beat and kill people, right? And so that's where that emerged from. I usually call it fund diversion, because defund the police has sort of, just the use of the language, sent a very, I think it sent the wrong message. It sent the message to people that I saw extreme reactions around this, even around people who I would consider to be very reasonable. They were like, well, Ron, I'm not really for defunding the police. And I was like, well, what they're really saying is sort of right-sizing the funding of police, right? I mean, if you've got, 1,000 calls to the police and 600 of those are mental health calls, why would you spend the money on an a personnel carrier from the military instead of spending it on different people who can actually help and assist these people, right? And there have been any number of smaller police departments that have been a couple in Kentucky and in other places that in fact directed some of their funds to hiring social workers, right? Instead of hiring on more officers, they said, well, let's hire police, let's hire a social worker. And they indeed saw a savings, a pretty significant savings in terms of cash, but also in terms of calls for service, and of course, police-related complaints. So that's what that really meant. So we're at the end of our time. And yes, thank you all so much for attending, and thank you for that message, Santo. And we really appreciate you all taking the time in late December to come, well, mid-December, but soon to be Christmas right around the corner, to come out and talk with us. Kamran, thank you for sharing this information. I know this has been something near and dear to your heart for a long time, and I'm glad you had a chance to share this information with everyone. So do we have any parting thoughts, Kamran?
Yeah, a little bit. So the main thoughts that we have at the end here is, what can you do? Well, what I would encourage to be done is to read and initiate book discussion on the topic of minority self-defense, recommendations being Blacks Against Empire by Joshua Bloom, really good book. Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton, another really good book. The Young Lords of Radical History by Johanna Hernandez. I haven't read that one yet. I've heard really good things about it. Like a Hurricane by Paul Chatt Smith. Also haven't read yet. Heard really good things about it. Observe Your Neighborhood, Business, School, or Place of Worship. Is there anything you see doing similar work or meeting similar needs? If so, be a helping hand. But make sure not to be a white savior if you are white, or to derail the thing. Learn about local chapters of these movements that have existed. And oh, Jean's telling me to show the slide. That's probably a good idea. Here it is. And then use your voice. Attend county board, city council, or school board meetings, and support those fighting for their current health, physical, and political oriented defense, and make sure to stay informed. Along with that, we have slides that you can look at here. It's good to read the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, the Young Lords 13-point program and platform, and then see if the institutions near here are fulfilling the things that were asked for then. And then you can look at the different self-education items there and share your voice. And then here's our sources. Thank you for attending.
Thank you all very much.